As the previous video installation had laid out the broad details of upcoming operations, which would be effectively the final battle for control over Beaumont, as a militia force trapped within the vicinity of Beaumont due to the early cruise missile strikes carried out by PLAN vessels at sea, effectively knocking out all but a handful of key strategic bridges in the area. This militia force of some 500 had now mustered and assembled as they had received credible, actionable intelligence from fleeing refugees that had fled the battle space inside of the heart of Beaumont ahead of the advance of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion and Combat Engineer Battalion of the larger PLAN Marine 6th Brigade as they conducted a broad sweep into the north into the heart of Beaumont to capture all of the critical objectives that lay in the Neches River Port area, as well as also the Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve site that had effectively fallen by noon on October the 4th, day one of the invasion, as the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion had been tasked with the eradication of the 373rd Combat Sustainment Support Battalion and the capture of their facility, which was the Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve Station. As now, this particular station of the Army Reserves had been turned into a PLAN Marine base of sorts as one of the three heavy amphibious Marine infantry companies, with the mortar company or the fire support company of 82mm self-propelled mortar systems and the headquarters and support company, which was the command and logistical elements over the entire Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, had effectively set up in the now recently captured installation, as the rest of the combat companies, which included the Combat Engineer Company of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, as well as also the two remaining Heavy Amphibious Marine Infantry companies and the two assault gun / light tank companies, had now moved on other objectives, as the Combat Engineer Company, in particular, of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, had made a dash down State Highway 90, which effectively was also College Street as it moved into the city toward the Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve site, to the west to capture the local municipal airport, which was also a lesser objective, but still an important objective, and it was taken effectively without a fight by the combat engineers, who had effectively moved into the abandoned facility and had taken control of it in order to conduct reconnaissance actions and interdiction activities from this strategically important location as it pertained to the overall battlefield and control of Beaumont, as in this particular zone, they could control all entry and exit into and out of the city from its west, as the airport itself, if we go to the map of the local area containing the airport, which was on the western edge of city limits, sat not only between the Amtrak passenger rail line, which is mauve or maroon color coding, whereas the brown color coding of rails was freight rail, which to the west, which was the last mile within the city before the city limits ended on the west, was an industrial park wherein there was also a large freight rail yard. There was a river, or also called a bayou, that ran through this area when we're looking at a map, and on the other side a creek, which also in the northeast quadrant of this map served as city limits, which separated this thickly wooded, forested area from the Golf Terrace Park, which was within city limits, as the airport itself, with its runway, its hangars, its office buildings, its air control tower, and more, sat in this area, all was brought under the PLAN Marine control, as the three combat platoons and headquarters platoon, with the three combat platoons spreading out, with the four Tiger MRAPs of the headquarters platoon also aiding in perimeter defense. These forces now flew their quadcopter assets and circuits all around this area. Already, the high-altitude assets had been patrolling this side of the battle space for quite some time, but with the addition of the quadcopter assets, the battle space could be mapped in ever more detail as the ISR surveillance apparatus of the coalition had a complete and total iron grip over this entire battle space and all the other battle spaces that were now in the process of combat operations, as the quadcopter assets overlaid with the high altitude assets with satellites above these all interlocking to map the battlefields in real time, as the ever fluid changing battlefields needed to be constantly mapped. Everything above ground effectively was seen by the PLAN Marine Forces, and the real-time AI battlefield data processing system crunched all data throughout all domains and used the ISR apparatus as its eyes and ears, and therefore also put together the strike packages for the air power that was available and allocated to this battle space, as well as the artillery firepower, also fire support assets such as the mortar companies within the light, medium, and heavy combined arms battalions of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, as well as other systems and vehicles, including also for the armed combat robots and the FPV drone operators, and also for the CH-901A loitering munition drone operators as well, and the vehicle crews of the various vehicles. As the squad and vehicle crews each had their own quadcopter asset, many hundreds of quadcopter assets were flying circuits all throughout this massive battle space, everywhere from the Beaumont area to the Vidor area to the Port Arthur area and to the Orange area. Only areas out in the far hinterlands were not, at the moment at least, being mapped out with quadcopter assets, and were mainly being mapped by high-altitude assets and satellites, as they were monitoring these forces that were gathering in the woods and swamps and marshlands in the general north of the battle space. These elements would be tackled by all available resources of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade and Coalition more broadly by day 2. As for the time being, the most important objective was securing Beaumont, as Vidor and Orange had earlier been secured, and Beaumont was the first city of all to be secured. The remaining areas that needed to be brought fully under PLAN Marine control were all areas adjacent to I-10, as all main entry and exit points were controlled into and out of the city by the PLAN Marines, as cruise missile strikes from the sea from PLAN vessels had taken out essentially all bridges other than those deemed strategically viable and important to the PLAN Marine operations, and thus many American defending forces had been trapped in specific areas or barred from entry and exit from others. As this was the case in the situation, there effectively were armed reactionary civilians that were disorganized groups that were coming together underground and in basements and other lower levels of the city to effectively try to band together and come up with plans of action, while there were better organized forces such as armed reactionary civilian militia groups, such as a grouping of 500 armed reactionary civilian militia elements that sat outside of the city within its immediate vicinity but to its west, and they had also likewise been trapped in the area due to the elimination of key bridges. Some had tried to swim across canals and other tributaries only to be struck from the air by the high altitude and armed CH-4A reconnaissance drone, which carried 16 ATGMs, which were anti-tank guided missiles that could be fired from the air. And already some 20 of the militia forces had been hit trying to swim across the canal, which made a major psychological effect on the rest, who decided that they had better come together and fast and attack the invaders where they currently were last known to be, as the refugees by 7 a.m., as the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion and Combat Engineer Battalions moved into the city, had fled in multiple directions, both north and west, and some even to the southwest, and had informed any forces en route, including these militia forces, of the goings-on. And this was vital, actionable intelligence that could be used, as the refugees that had fled ahead of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion at the Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve Site area had effectively ran into the militia leadership of this particular militia, informed them of what was going on by 9 a.m. as they had fled by 7, arriving roughly 2 hours later, mostly on foot. And essentially, these forces had been trying to come up with an action plan and were mustering together ever since. The only reason why they even had the opportunity to do this relatively unscathed up to this point is because the limited resources of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade were widely focused at this point in time when the refugees had informed them of the goings-on the battle in Vidor, the battle in Orange, as well as the fighting erupting within Beaumont, and therefore these forces had time to come out of their homes in this area and also their quasi-fortified militia compound, which was a private property owned by the leadership of the militia, and come together and try to muster and assemble their forces while the vast majority of the 6th PLAN Marines Brigade's resources were focused on other objectives. They would also have a very thin window of time with which to safely get into the city of Beaumont, thereby infiltrating it through the thickly wooded areas and going underground through drainage and sewage and other underground systems to get into the heart of Beaumont to conduct their attacks, as the very mighty, formidable air power of the coalition in this particular battle space, such as the Su-34 Strike Aircraft Squadron and the 2 J-10 squadrons, had carried out their RTB by 9 a.m. when the refugees were just beginning to tell the militia leadership of their goings-on in the city, as these aircraft had pounded many positions before they carried out their RTB, leveling entire portions of the city, which had effectively been brought completely to the ground in massive rubble piles, while other parts of the city, at least up until this point, had been left relatively unscathed, such as the general west of Beaumont and parts of its north, while other parts were horribly battle damaged from the airstrikes, artillery strikes, and more. As Beaumont was a medium-sized city and relatively well spread out, the city, now under assault by 2 battalions, would see much of the heaviest fighting in its center and its east, as the vital objectives of the city were located in these particular areas. And the most important objective of all, being I-10, would absolutely have to be secured for the 4th generation warfare doctrines to be put into full effect, as the external invasion components needed their key invasion route of I-10 to take them from the south central invasion sector, which of course included Texas, into the southeastern invasion sector, which was literally adjacent and to the east of this battle space across the Sabine River, as the I-10 Sabine River Bridge was now being held by noon, of course, as earlier taken by the Light Combined Arms Battalions comprising companies, as the fighting in the city of Beaumont was already excessive and heavy between the PLAN Marines and the U.S. Army reservists in the area and other military personnel. By noon, much of the fighting will have wrapped up for the most important objectives of the city, as Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve Site would fall by noon, and all but the headquarters building itself of the U.S. Military Sea Lift Command will have also fallen, which included the 842nd Transportation Battalion's installation, the 596 Transport Group's installation, and the port and all of its industrial and energy facilities, as the standoff, which lasted hours to take intact the headquarters building of the U.S. Military Sea Lift Command and its leadership echelon alive and intact, would last until 1 p.m. Just after 1 p.m. would be the return of the air power, as the artillery forces of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, as the battalion of PLZ-07 122mm howitzers, was comprised of 56 of these howitzers. The 3 firing batteries that had been devoted to the Vidor operations in support of both the Recon Battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, having moved into town by 5 a.m., with the Medium Combined Arms Battalion arriving by 6, and then ensuing a battle whereby they had flushed out the town of its militia forces. The 3 firing batteries of the artillery battalion that had been supporting the Vidor operation will have been conducting maintenance after the Vidor battle ended, as they would be doing so, and the artillery devoted to supporting the Beaumont operations, including the air assault companies of 2 air assault marine infantry holding the I-10 bridge in the southwest, will have finally wrapped up many of these operations by noon in terms of their fire missions in support of these operations. The artillery would then be able to shift the full brunt of its might in support of the Beaumont battles that would be unfolding for control of the city shortly thereafter, as the PLA and Marines will have achieved a major victory in securing the objectives inside of the city. Now they would have to fight to hold on to them, which included I-10, as the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion in particular would have to deploy its powerful forces in order to defend I-10 in the city, as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system through the ISR apparatus could see everything above ground, including both friendly and enemy movements. This allowed for the most efficient deployment of combat forces, and therefore the 2 assault gun / light tank companies within the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, as well as the 2 remaining heavy amphibious marine infantry companies, would be deployed around I-10 in the heart of the city, as they would be spaced out, whereby there would be in the south an assault gun / light tank company, then a heavy amphibious marine infantry company, another assault gun / light tank company, and then the last amphibious heavy marine infantry company guarding I-10, while the combat engineer company had been dispatched by and arriving by 12:30, capturing the local municipal airport unopposed, as the combat engineer battalion at this time was effectively wrapping up its operations to capture the headquarters building of the U.S. Military Seal of Command. Approximately 30 minutes later, one of their 2 unused combat companies, after their headquarters and support company had moved into the freshly captured 596 Transport Group's installation, would be sent to take a water treatment plant and clear it of a pocket of armed reactionary civilians and some renegade military personnel who had fled ahead of their advance in the chaos, and the other unused company to clear an area north of I-10, as I-10 was now the key focus of operations. At noon, there would be a small window of time by which the militia forces, the grouping of 500, would be able to try to infiltrate the city before the return of the massive air power of both the PLAAF with their 2 J-10 squadrons and the Russian VVS with their Su-34 strike aircraft squadron, as well as also the leveraging of the artillery firepower against these forces in and around Beaumont, as, again, the artillery batteries, most of them by this time were doing maintenance, as they still kept a few on station for fire missions. These few artillery batteries within the artillery battalion would shell the tail end of the first 2 out of 3 groups of the militia forces trying to infiltrate the city. But fortunately for the militia forces, their leadership was wise enough to order them to effectively spread out widely in order to minimize casualties from Chi-Com and coalition munitions more broadly, as they spread out in their massive advance, in their rapid advance towards the heart of Beaumont. They would travel through the thickly wooded terrain outside of the city from where they had mustered, and they would infiltrate the city by abandoning many of their all-terrain vehicles, as many of them had all-terrain vehicles for rapid movement, as well as also they're using their technicals mostly as supply vehicles, and would quickly make it to these drainage and sewage entry points and begin to offload supplies from their vehicles, although some vehicles would be hit by artillery strikes of the available howitzers and fire missions, and other small clusters of men being hit. But for the most part, the first two groups would effectively mostly make it relatively intact into the city's underground, whereby they would eventually encounter, in terms of the militia personnel, the U.S. Army reservists who were hiding underground and had been conducting reconnaissance activities of their own, mostly observing the activities above ground through manhole covers, whereby they could quickly slip back underground to safety if necessary, or using the sewage systems to get into underground maintenance tunnels, which led into basement levels of certain buildings, whereby they could actually come up into these buildings and observe from within them, and then again disappear back underground. They use these methods to obtain relatively decent actionable intelligence of the current goings on above ground, including now spotting supply convoys that were being sent out of the Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve installation to support their combat companies spread out along I-10, as supplies were being built up by these supply convoys from the headquarters and support company, now safely inside of the Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve site and surrounded by one of the battalion's 3 heavy amphibious marine infantry companies, which guarded the perimeter of the recently captured installation. The self-propelled 82mm mortars of the 82mm Mortar Company also set up in this installation to provide fire support in the local area to their combat companies guarding I-10. I-10 was absolutely precious in terms of its importance to the coalition as a key invasion route for their 4th-generation warfare doctrines, as the external components were to be the heavy-handed reinforcements of the Trojan shock armies originating on CCP regime properties, and this included those now fighting in key battle spaces in the southeastern invasion sector, and Group Armies 16 through 20 were to be their heavy-handed reinforcements, and they had to travel through this key node of Beaumont and all the other key nodes along the way. And Beaumont, being a medium-sized city, absolutely needed to be brought under control, as the urban terrain effectively created challenges for the occupation forces as the invaders turned occupiers. And this effectively would be seen in the final climactic battle for control over the city in the early onset of the invasion on day 1. As Beaumont was now the key focus of PLAN Marine operations of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, as the supplies had been spotted being run down College Street and up the access road of I-10 to get to the combat companies defending it, the observant Army reservists were tailoring plans of their own, only to be effectively pleased with the forthcoming reinforcements. Unbeknownst to them, the militia members showing up would effectively enhance their planning, as they brought certain weapon systems of their own, which would play a key role in the major ambush that would occur against a supply convoy, or effectively one of the platoons of the headquarters and support company sent to deliver supplies. As these militiamen had effectively, some among their ranks were experts at building certain devices. Although their devices were crude due to available resources, effectively, over time, improvised devices would get better and better as the Americans would learn and obtain better materials to build these devices. This particular militia group, as again, all of these militias had been formed around defending their local communities against the horde of foreign criminal elements, as international criminals had permeated the nation through its borders due to the failed border crisis, the failed border policies, and the crisis that followed. These personnel, though relatively well equipped, disciplined, and armed, as they were comprised mostly of ex-military as well as also ex-law enforcement and other trained professionals, the devices that they brought to bear, again, one being a device involving a propane tank, pipes, and ball bearings, as well as a car battery and cables, and the other being a much larger fertilizer-based device, and another, yet still, being a sort of shape-charge device, where most munitions blasted as a shotgun effect. This munition could be pointed and aimed at a particular target, as effectively molten copper can go through almost any type of armor, and in this case would be used relatively effectively against a PLAN Marine Tiger MRAP in this ambush. As truck keys would also be obtained from two civilian unarmed refugees hiding in the sewer system, as this would enable their two abandoned vehicles above ground to be utilized as a blocking mechanism to effectively enhance the ambush. These vehicles, effectively, if we go to the map of the southernmost portion of the battle space that would be in question as the militia personnel infiltrated the city and would come up from underground in this area, the ambush effectively would be set rapidly, as there had been another convoy assembling to deliver supplies, and the U.S. Army reservists had hastily come together and effectively had tried to coordinate and plan with the militia personnel for this ambush. And as College Street, due to many other streets just in the mile separating this map from the Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve area, had been hit by earlier air and artillery strikes, causing some of the roads to be congested with destroyed or abandoned vehicles, as well as also rubble in the streets. College Street was the most effective route to get to these forces, as they would come straight out of Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve site on College Street and take it to the access road and move to the general north along the access road to supply the combat companies, as this was the most efficient route, according to the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. These militiamen and the Army reservists operating in the area would be very wise to set up this ambush not only at a turn, which would tactically be a slowing down point for the convoy, but also using the vehicles that had been donated, so to speak, by the refugees to pull in a sort of herringbone or diagonal formation that would make even it difficult for an MRAP to push out of the way, being parked in such a manner, which all of this would be carried out very quickly, as this had to be done fast in order to have any sort of real effect on the PLAN Marine convoy, as again, quadcopter assets were constantly monitoring the battle space. And although they were wise to do this adjacent to I-10, which would negate the powerful air power of the coalition, as the Chinese PLAAF and Russian VBS wouldn't dare to drop munitions near the key invasion route immediately adjacent, and also massed artillery fires, they would still be vulnerable to 82mm mortar strikes, which were less destructive but also very surgical. And also they would be effectively targets for loitering munitions, such as CH-901As fired by the specialized drone operators within the headquarters platoon of this southernmost company of assault gun/light tanks, as the ZBDO-5 assault gun/light tanks themselves are also very potent weapons, as they could be used as an assault gun or light tank in this role with their 105mm rifled tank guns. And they would be used exceedingly effectively in this role in this battle, as also there were the heavy amphibious Marine infantry forces with their ZBDO-5 IFV versions with their 30mm autocannon, 12.7mm heavy machine gun, and rail-mounted on the turret HJ-73C short-range ATGMs. All of this firepower combined, guided through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system through the ISR apparatus, would be simply massive. Even the convoy would not go down without a fight, as the Shangji supply trucks had a turret-mounted machine gun, in this case a 7.62 by 54mm machine gun, like a Type 67 or similar, would be mounted on these vehicles for self-defense, as well as also the heavier, more powerful W85 12.7mm heavy machine guns mounted on the Tiger MRAPs. The Tiger MRAPs were relatively robust and strong vehicles, which could withstand all small arms fire up to 50 caliber ammunition on the sides, back, and front, although the roof was slightly vulnerable to 50 caliber ammunition as it was the weakest point. This would still be difficult to effectively hit these vehicles with any sort of accuracy, as they would not sit completely still despite the attempt at blocking them after the turn onto the access road, as they would continue with the lead MRAP to try to plow the vehicles out of the way, backing up and then moving forward, crashing into them repeatedly. It would take the immediate assistance of a rescue force put together by one of the 4 combat platoons of the assault gun / light tank company, which would effectively be sent south in order to bail out the embattled convoy, as this convoy would lose half of its logistical vehicles, as it would lose one of its Fall MV3 fuelers or fuel trucks. It would also lose 2 of its Shangji supply trucks, as the fuel truck itself would be hit by multiple different systems, everything from small arms fire, including fire from the U.S. military personnel who would be assisting in the ambush, although not pictured in this animation or illustration, as it's all militia personnel. The militia personnel would be firing their small arms, such as their standard 5.56 rifles, as they either used the AR-15s or they used Mini 14s, as they both used 5.56 ammo, but they also had Century arms, which were the imported foreign weapons, such as this RPK, that were semi-automatic, but they reconverted it to full automatic so that it could be an effective light machine gun for some of the militia squads, and it would serve a relatively effective role in that particular purpose as a light machine gun, as it would fulfill its role as a light machine gun with 7.62 by 39 millimeter ammunition. The standardization of ammunition in this militia was actually a relatively good boost to their operations, as standardized logistics made their operations far more smooth, as militias that had less standardization had a harder time getting ammunition to their forces, as they had to ensure they brought the right ammunition for the right firearm. And as this militia was more professional and made up of more professional personnel, their different weapons were more streamlined, as they used their rifles 5.56, they used their light machine guns in 7.62 by 39, and they used Barrett 50 sniper rifles acquired on the civilian market, as these were their most powerful weapons of all, along with also their Molotov cocktails they'd put together and their improvised devices of different types. One Shangji supply truck would be completely demolished by the fertilizer-based munition improvised device, while another would take massive hits from 50 caliber fire, as well as also 40 millimeter fire of 40 millimeter grenades from 203 launchers beneath the rifles of some of the U.S. Army reservists assisting in the ambush, as well as also being hit by hand grenades tossed by the U.S. Army reservists, Molotov cocktails, again from the militiamen, and effectively just all around heavy small arms fire, which would effectively hit this fuel truck nearly all simultaneously, catching the fuel truck on fire and then causing primary, secondary, and even tertiary explosions as the driver would try to bail. A secondary explosion would heave shrapnel through his armor and into him, rip his arm off, and also throw flaming pieces of the fuel tank in multiple directions, including up against this building, causing immense damage to the surrounding area, including also this parked car on the side of the street, causing it to catch fire, bending the stop sign. The heavy fire that would ensue would cause billowing smoke that could be seen for many miles, as the Shangji supply truck would be ripped to shreds. The EFP-styled munition, which should be further up after the turn, would go through the back of the Tiger MRAP, effectively wiping out the, as it sat 4 in the very back, it would wipe out 2 personnel that sat on the right-hand backside and would horribly maim the other 2, who would be immediately after being freed up out of this ambush, be rushed to the headquarters platoon of this assault gun / light tank company, as they had an armored ambulance version of the ZBD-05, which could accommodate 4 patients at a time. And that ambulance would definitely be filled up to capacity, as eventually they would even have to call in a medevac flight from the Transport Aviation Battalion, company of the Air Assault Battalion with their Z-18 utility helos, as these were the attack helo gunships, the Z-9WAs. The Z-18s had a large carrying capacity, and as the battle in general around the heart of Beaumont after noon, between 2 p.m. and 5:45 p.m., when it would finally end, just literal minutes before the external invasion prong entered at the very southwesternmost point of the battle space, there would be some 24 KIAs on the PLAN Marine side, as well as 30 WIAs, some of them critical, and some would even pass away and become further KIAs, as they would not be able to be saved, as their injuries would serve to be mortal wounds. As this illustration or animation of the ambush effectively would be how it would turn out, as the heavy fire from both the defending MRAPs, as the MRAPs were interspersed in between the supply vehicles, would fire back heavily at the personnel that were on the building tops and even in the buildings, firing from within, as the heavy firepower of the 12.7 millimeter machine gun was simply devastating, as it was an anti-materiel round and could rip through flimsy building materials and go through walls and up and out of the roofs or out of the other side of the building in some cases, depending on what part of the building materials it hit and went through, as these personnel on the roof were being, like this man losing part of his head to a 12.7 millimeter round as the turret gunner was spraying this general area. This man back here near the air conditioner unit on the top of the roof had been hit by rounds coming up out of the ceiling and into him as he ran through this area. Some were firing around corners, others throwing Molotovs off of roofs. It was a hellish fight. This man had been wiped out trying to take cover behind this ledge and hit by rounds coming through the wall here. This man being hit in the head through his helmet, as the vehicle that was behind the fuel truck, the turret gunner of that Shangji supply truck, was spraying this wall of this building, including the top part here, went right through his Kevlar helmet and out the other end. As this, again, was simply a hellish battle. The addition of the loitering munition strikes, such as the CH-901As with their fragmentation warheads, would be absolutely destructive against dismounted targets or light-skinned vehicles, in this case, dismounted militia or Army Reserve targets. As also the 82mm mortar strikes would come down on certain buildings, these two would wipe out many of the attackers. As the original plan for the ambush called for the militia and Army Reservists and working together in the particular ambush to try to wipe out the convoy, yes, but also to try to scavenge rapidly whatever weapons and other supplies they could obtain from the destroyed supply trucks, if anything was left, and utilize this to build their logistical base, as they had intended to disappear back underground quickly and try to form a partisan network to continually harass and resist the PLAN Marines, which would go from invader to occupier. As this plan would utterly fail, as they were drawn into a battle that they had not planned for, as in they would effectively be fixed in place and then destroyed by the rescue force, the assault gun / light tank platoon sent in to free the trapped convoy and also eradicate all armed resistance near I-10. These forces would indeed be gradually wiped out, and very few out of the total of 500 militiamen, plus the additional roughly 40 Army Reservists, and, of course, the 150 additional armed reactionary civilians that were in the far northwest quadrant of this battle space, as they would be hit heavily by airstrikes, such as this Su-34 strike, as each of these aircraft dropped a punishing 12,000 pounds each of air-to-ground munitions on this area of 150 personnel. Artillery strikes would happen off the map to the northwest, as well as artillery strikes in this northern map, hitting all of these restaurants and businesses and hotels and other areas that would be inhabited by militiamen and other armed reactionary civilians. As again, there were 150 non-militia armed reactionary civilians who were all in this northwest quadrant. The other 150 out of the grouping of 300 in this area would flee from the artillery and airstrikes right into the waiting arms of elements of the PLAN 6th Marine Brigade's Air Assault Battalion, holding their position by the State Highway 96 bridge crossing. So they would be wiped out by the combination of TAC Helo gunships constantly patrolling this area of the Combat Aviation Company of the Air Assault Battalion, as well as also the ground troops of the two waiting Air Assault Marine Infantry companies, who also had their mortar company with them of 82mm mortars for fire support. Of course, artillery would continue to strike in the north by these areas here on the northern end of the city in support of the air assault forces, as well as also airstrikes in that area, as these fleeing groupings of armed civilians coming up out of underground would be constantly hit by artillery fire missions and airstrikes as they fled into the waiting arms of the air assault troops. Meanwhile, in the battle in the heart of Beaumont, as the militia forces had infiltrated the city in the first two groups, largely, with very small numbers of them being wiped out by artillery strikes, the third and final group that would move through the area a bit later, between 2 and 3 p.m., would be absolutely ravaged by the presence of the Combat Engineer Company of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, who occupied the airport. Again, the airport sat in a very strategic location in regards to the layout of Beaumont, as major roads passed to the north and to the south, as State Highway 90, which became College Street, including in this map, which is College Street here, which also became State Highway 90 as it left the city moving westward. And to the north, Sour Lake Road, which became Felon Avenue, Phelan, or Felon Boulevard, rather, which ran to the northeast until it reached this map, where it ran under I-10/State Highway 96, as I-10 and 96 were part of the same road network in this area before I-10 branches off to become I-10 again, and 96 continues north. This was Phelan Boulevard, and this was Laurel Avenue, which went over the highway. There's a bridge of the street here, goes over the highway. And, of course, there was 11th Street and 13th Street. 11th Street went through this kilometer of land separating this map and this map. It's really a kilometer separating these maps, and continued down through this area as 11th Street went by the Amtrak train station, which would be fought over in a very heavy battle, as two PLAN Marine squads would fight over the train station for a couple of hours, as the dogged resistance from the militia personnel and the Army reservists of a single squad of reservists, as one of their ad hoc, hastily thrown together squads of the renegade troops, would enter the train station early on in the battle, only to then have to engage the PLAN Marines, who would storm the building and clear it of any and all resistance as they moved through the city. As they would arrive at the Amtrak station, they would fight a bloody battle through its open corridors, platforms, and offices. The battle was spread over a sizable area, which included, of course, in the south, an area spanning 1 mile east-west by 1.5 miles north-south. In the kilometer that separated the southern map and the northern map, there effectively was no real action occurring in terms of combat operations, but in the northern sector, in this 1.5 mile east-west by 1 mile north-south area, the combat in this area would be heavy as well. The PLAN Marines would also be ambushed in this area, as well as in this hospital campus here, which these streets ran through, this large hospital campus. One of the office buildings would be infiltrated from underground, as the sewage systems connected to maintenance tunnels, which led into the basement levels,
25 total militiamen, 20 would stay in the building, and 5 would come up on the roof with 15 Army reservists, effectively 2 squads of Army reservists, or squad-sized elements, it should be said, and would fire down at the headquarters platoon and their soft-skinned supply vehicles of their Shangji trucks, the headquarters platoon of this particular heavy amphibious marine infantry company. As there was a platoon dedicated to clearing the hospital area, 2 of the squads would be sent in to clear this building, where they would run into a nasty surprise that awaited them, effectively the smaller of the 3 improvised devices, which was set in the hallway. Not powerful enough, of course, to bring the building down, but it was definitely powerful enough to wipe out personnel with its ball bearings, pipes, and also the addition of the propane tank and effectively car battery and cables to effectively set it all off. And it would be set off by one of these 20 personnel that was watching down the corridor for these forces to enter, and they would lose lives in the process in terms of the PLAN Marines, while the rest would storm the building and clear it of these personnel, with the forces on the roof firing down and in the building firing out of the building at this IFV version of the CBD-05. It would return heavy fire with its powerful 30mm autocannon and 12.7mm W85 heavy machine gun turret gunner on the roof of the vehicle's turret. As the troops would storm the nearby buildings to clear their own flanks, this squad, in a double-column rolling shield, would enter this building on the hospital campus, crossing the street in the parking lot, and effectively clearing the building and getting on its roof to assist as these squads moved in to clear it, while the Tiger MRAP, one of 4 that was spaced out to guard the softer, lighter vehicles of the headquarters platoon, its logistical vehicles and command vehicle, as it had its armored recovery vehicle, its supply trucks, and its armored ambulance and command vehicle and field truck. These spread out Tiger MRAPs, along with these spread out IFVs of one of their 4 combat platoons in this area, were defending the lighter headquarters platoon, which was the command and logistical elements over this particular heavy amphibious marine infantry company in this area, as they would be attacked from the roof and from within the building by some of the 20 that occupied the building, the others firing out in this direction, and against the breaching 2 squads. Again, these 2 squads that breached would be met with one of the improvised devices as they moved down the hallway, and would lose some troops. As 2 squads were sent in to clear this parking garage connected to the main campus of the hospital, one would take to the roof while the other would stay inside of this large hospital building. As many actions were unfolding at the very opening of this map, which included the arrival of militia personnel coming out of the manhole covers in the area, entering these buildings and moving from building to building, parking lot to parking lot, area to area. They would shortly be hit with enormous mortar, artillery, and airstrikes, at least initially. At the very opening, 10 minutes in, the first airstrike on the northern map would come in with these 2 Su-34 strike aircraft, along with artillery off-map, wiping out 150 non-militia armed reactionary civilians in the area, including all of these armed civilians, standard armed civilians, moving down the street here at this time. All of these buildings would be completely smashed and leveled in this particular airstrike. It would be 30 minutes later that the J-10 strike would come in on the northernmost map, as each J-10 would drop 8,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions on the large shopping center below, as there was a sizable number of militiamen in this area moving through these chain restaurants that many people know, and also businesses in this particular area, gas station, as well as also in this shopping center itself. This area would be pounded by airstrikes from these 4 J-10 fighters. As the J-10s returned, primarily now armed with air-to-ground munitions instead of air-to-air munitions, although they did retain a pair of PL-12 air-to-air missiles for self-defense as per SOP, even though there was no more air threats to contend with. It was done as a matter of SOP. They carried 12,000 pounds each of air-to-ground munitions, which added significantly to the overall combat power as a force multiplier of the coalition's air power in this battle space, as already the gargantuan payload carried by the very powerful Su-34 strike aircraft at 26,000 pounds was simply monumental, and adding the 24 returning J-10s of the two J-10 squadrons, each with 12,000 pounds, was ever more so in the sense of the massive firepower brought to bear from the skies. The artillery, of course, now again shifting all of its weight into the fighting occurring in and to the west of Beaumont, as the fighting by the municipal airport would effectively be the shortest lived, as the combat engineer company that held this area was guarding the perimeter and having already moved into the offices and taken control of the hangars and also the air traffic control building and the perimeter, would defend the perimeter against attacks from the west from this warehouse building in this large industrial park, which would ultimately see massed artillery fire, repeated 122mm shell strikes coming in and hitting and demolishing this building, with 30 militiamen having had come in to draw the attention of these forces away from the third and final group moving in to infiltrate the city from the north. This would ultimately fail, however, as the quadcopters now were running circuits all throughout the west due to its location in the central west, as in it was in the center in general of the north and the south of Beaumont. The quadcopters running circles through the west could effectively aid the high altitude assets in seeing everything, along with the satellite assets. And everything was being mapped in real time, including in this thickly wooded area where these forces were fording this river, or what was called a bayou. If one were to look at a map of this area, there was a river or bayou with a fork in this area. This was Sour Lake Road, which became Phelan Boulevard. This was State Highway 90 in the south. The logistical or supply trucks covered with tarp in the back, covering up their logistical assets, their ammunition, their fuel, their water and food. These would all be interdicted, again, due to the strategic location of these forces sitting right in the center of these roads, and would be annihilated by ground-based fires, loitering munition strikes, and also even hits from FPV drones, as the 4 FPV drone operators in the headquarters platoon would launch 2 waves of 4 FPV drones each, first this wave and then this follow-up wave. These FPV drones would absolutely be a menace to the militia forces on the ground, as would the forthcoming potent artillery fire to deal with the sniper spotter teams of former U.S. military snipers that were trying to take positions on the higher ground to fire into these forces that occupied the airport, as they had tried to coordinate an attack against the airport, partially to allow for their supplies to try to get through, as they're firing over their vehicles. Their vehicles were safe from the fire from these personnel, as they're firing literally over them and into the airport. They were also doing this attack to try to allow for this grouping to get through. Although, again, unbeknownst to these militia forces, they had a relatively lucky go at things, at least for now, as again, they had a very unique window of time to infiltrate the city a bit earlier, but now after 1 p.m., with the return of the air power, between 2 and 3 p.m., these forces would simply be eradicated by Su-34 strikes, as 2 pairs of Su-34s would pound this area and the area just north off map, where there were 30 more personnel spread out widely trying to move through the area and infiltrate the city through the terrace or the Golf Terrace Park, which led to neighborhoods, which led to drainage systems and sewage systems to get into the city. They would all be pounded mercilessly by these very powerful airstrikes, particularly in this area where a combined 32,000 pounds, each aircraft dropping 16,000 pounds each of air-to-ground munitions, would spread through this area and annihilate everything in this area, with this last group fording the bayou or the river being mercilessly slaughtered by the 122 millimeter repeated shell fire into that area. As one of the 7 firing batteries, not counting, of course, the headquarters and support battery, one of the 7 firing batteries was completely devoted now to this area in support of the Combat Engineer Company of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion. They would fire all 8 of their howitzers repeatedly into this area, as well as dealing with these snipers and spotter teams on these hills who constantly tried to relocate. The first group to be hit would be this sniper spotter team, who repeatedly fired 50 cal ammunition at this armed combat robot, eventually destroying it, as the armed combat robots were relatively durable and robust and could take a lot of punishment. Repeated 50 cal fires could eventually, due to the sheer kinetic force, simply bust up these bots, and effectively they would lose one armed combat robot to repeated fires from 50 caliber ammunition that was standing guard near this entrance, where this other one was watching the entrance on Keith Road here. And as a result, heavy fire was not only being fired into this thickly wooded area and into the hills by the ground-based forces, they would be joined by precision artillery strikes guided by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. Multiple shells would land on and on the hillside, on top and on the hillside, destroying these personnel here first, with more precision fires also being devoted to next slamming this grouping right here, hitting them first, while this group, having it fired and wiped out 3 PLAN Marines out of this whole squad, also firing at their armed combat robot and vehicle, would try to relocate and then conduct fires from here and then quickly relocate again, only to then be destroyed last out of these remaining groups, as this group will be destroyed in the third of the line of these groups, as this group was destroyed first by precision strikes, then this group here, then this group would be hit, and then followed by this group trying to relocate being hit, and then finally, as this group fired from here and relocated, they then would also be hit. As the remaining 6 of 7 firing batteries were all devoted to the fighting in the city, much more firepower from artillery would be concentrated there naturally, as the air power would also be utilized, but away from the highway system, as again, the armed reactionary civilian militia forces, with guidance, advice, and assistance from the U.S. Army Reservists, had tailored their plan relatively well, as they were fully aware that the PLAN Marines were going out of their way to try to preserve certain infrastructure, and this included road networks, as they were keenly observant, and therefore setting up their ambush immediately adjacent I-10, again, negated air attacks from the very powerful PLAAF and VVS air assets, as well as also massed artillery fires too close to the highway. Therefore, the weapons choices were more limited to counter their ambush, which they intended to try to carry out quickly, but due to the tenacity of the logistical and supply troops of the PLAN Marines fighting back, although they were under heavy assault, this effectively would be a drawn-out ambush and last a full hour, while the platoon that was sent in as a rescue force of assault gun/light tanks would also be ambushed by armed civilians that had moved into this building, quickly got on its roof and tried to fire down at them and heave Molotovs, with 8 more coming out of the building as the convoy got to this position and tried to heave Molotovs, only to be quickly cut down by the turret gunners as they fired both up at the personnel in the building and down at those running out of the building at them, trying to throw Molotovs, which would fall just short of their targets, being these vehicles, as they were literally cut down as they came out of the building. They're being fired at on the roof as well, but their Molotovs fell just short of these vehicles, as they would also be hit by a loitering munition strike that would hit this group on the roof with a fragmentation warhead, finishing them off quickly, allowing for the assault gun/light tanks to continue on their mission. As this temporary holdup didn't last for very long, although it lasted for approximately 15 minutes, they, by the time of finishing these personnel off, then fired their very powerful main gun and the lead assault gun slash light tank at these concrete walls that effectively were in the way and trying to wipe out these personnel who were now firing at them as they got closer, as indicated by the cyan color on this arrow. At the opening of the map, this squad of reservists, an ad hoc squad thrown together by the remaining reservists that had survived up until this point, had moved quickly into this particular building as they, from all the way, approximately a kilometer away, had been fired at by the machine gun turret on the roof of one of the assault gun slash light tanks as the turret gunner was firing down the street at these personnel as they crossed, which is why there's red here. They would make it into the building as they rapidly crossed the street and just barely missed being shredded apart by the potent 12.7 millimeter ammunition before then bounding into the train station, first across the tracks and then onto the platforms that were outside and then into the main building. At this time also, at the opening, this grouping of armed civilians, having moved through the general parking area and the general train station area, were moving between these buildings on the train station campus, moving across the street and getting into this building, while this squad in a wedge formation and this squad in a rolling T, having just dismounted from their assault gun slash light tanks, were both storming these buildings to clear them of any potential armed resistance. Finding none in the first building near this school campus where their headquarters platoon was just off map to the slight northeast of this football field. All these brown clumps of trees here indicated wooded areas. This was the main school building, and they were just off the map, which was the force that this convoy that was now embattled was trying to reach. At the opening of the map, these militiamen started to fire off the roof of this taller building and heave Molotovs, and were starting to hit the first of two fuel trucks relatively heavily. The small squad-sized unit of Army reservists on this building, it would have been just across the way here, were firing their 40 millimeter 203 tube-fired grenades at the fuel truck as well, and others firing at the Shangji supply trucks, who were also returning fire with their cab-mounted 7.62 by 54 millimeter turrets, as their turret gunners tried to return fire. As they all had staggered weapons, everyone from the MRAPs to the Shangji supply trucks. The only vehicles that didn't have any crew serve weapons were the Fall MV3 fuelers. They did not have any means of self-defense other than the driver and the TC firing their weapons out of each door, as they were the most vulnerable of all the vehicles in the convoy. One was completely lost to the hail of fire, as this happened quickly, as again, these forces infiltrated these buildings from underground, and they quickly got on the rooftop, and they climbed onto this building using the ladders on the side of the buildings to get on top of some of the other ones, such as in the shopping center here, immediately adjacent to the highway. These concrete abutments would be used for cover, as this drainage canal, which ran behind the rehabilitation hospital and separated this suburban-like neighborhood from the rehabilitation hospital as the canal ran through this area, this canal was used to infiltrate the hospital as well as to escape from the parking garage. At the very opening, 50 personnel made a mad dash for this drainage culvert, which led into the sewage and drainage systems, as they ran out of this parking garage as the assault gun slash light tanks were firing direct fire into this parking garage with HE shells, frag T shells, and heat shells, as well as also their heavy machine gun fires, while there would still be 15 remaining inside as the fighting would be heavy, and there were also others on the roof here. There was approximately another 15 on the roof, and they would be hit heavily by artillery. As mentioned before, the company captain of this particular assault gun slash light tank company didn't want war crimes on his conscience, as the PLAN Marines were not nearly as brutal as the People's Armed Police, who wouldn't have cared whatsoever at all about the civilian casualties in the hospital, as there were still patients in the hospital who couldn't be evacuated. And unbeknownst to the American forces, they were inadvertently using them as human shields, whether they realized it or wanted to or not, as they had moved into the hospital. As the hospital was a robust concrete building, and the parking garage was an even more sturdy civilian structure, it would be pounded heavily by artillery, but would remain standing, as the top part of it would be pockmarked and heavily cratered. The thick concrete and steel reinforced structure would continue standing despite all of the repeated 105 millimeter direct fires from the assault gun slash light tanks and the heavy artillery barrage pounding this parking garage on its roof wiping out the personnel on top, of course, but they're also wiping out personnel in the overflow parking area where this wall separated these businesses from this part of the hospital campus. 82 millimeter mortar fires and artillery would also wipe out other personnel trying to hide amid the abandoned vehicles in the parking lot, firing at these assault gun/light tanks, who were all at this point taking fire, as indicated by the cyan color on their vehicles. This one had cyan and olive color, as these Army reservists on the roof had the one 240 Bravo they managed to escape with underground, with 2 bandoliers of ammunition containing 200 rounds each. So they used it relatively sparingly, only when they thought they had a good shot, and they repeatedly tried to fire at the turret gunner of this assault gun/light tank anytime he would put his head above the hatch. And fire was naturally returned heavily, although again, the shell choices were limited to Frag T ammunition, as again, the company captain of this company was going out of his way to limit non-combatant casualties if at all possible, especially persons that were in the hospital. Mortar strikes would be called instead on the roof, and only Frag T shells and 12.7 millimeter ammunition would be used, and only when they had a good shot at personnel firing from out the windows. So there had been 30 personnel that went in this building. This building contained only 20 personnel, and there were 4 personnel hiding in this concrete, effectively flower bed area by this pull-in area to the emergency room of this rehabilitation hospital. The relief force, or the rescue force, by the time they had reached this point here, had fired at the wall, blasted these concrete walls on either side of the train tracks to pieces, and were also firing direct fire into these groupings of 5 who were trying to fire at them and heave Molotovs, but it would be too late for them as they would be wiped out. And these vehicles would then effectively break off of their single column, as they would effectively break off into 2 vehicles going in this direction and 2 going in this direction. One would move along this wall and stop here, while another would take position here, so they could provide mutual arcs of supporting fire, or interlocking fields of fire, while these 2 would move over here at first and then move down here and would lay down heavy fire at these forces who came out of the drainage system early on in the operations. As they had moved out in this grouping of 40, they broke into squad-sized groups, 10 each, and took positions along the concrete abutments as the ambush had been set up and these 2 vehicles pulled into a sort of diagonal or herringbone formation to make it hard to get through. The drivers bailed and got into fighting positions behind the concrete abutment, and all were laying down fire in multiple directions against this convoy as it made its turn. Again, the fuel truck, hit by multiple types of weaponry, simply caught aflame and eventually began to blow apart in multiple explosions as the fire grew, as the fertilizer-based munition, which is planted here on this corner, would blast a Shangji supply truck to absolute oblivion with its crew members inside. As it had its gunner, its TC, and driver, they were all wiped out. Many of the supplies were either destroyed or terribly damaged, many unusable. And the lead MRAP, the lead Tiger MRAP, would again take an EFP munition to its back as it was aimed slightly at about 30 degrees and would go through, taking the heads off of 2 of the personnel and horribly maiming others in the very back of the vehicle. Although it would only go through one side of the armor, but not out the other side, as it was a crude EFP device, but it worked well enough to where it caused some casualties of this squad that was part of the security force of this vehicle column. As that MRAP would continue to back up and slam into these vehicles, trying to desperately push them out of the way, the gunner was trying to lay down fire as much as possible on these forces, firing in this direction as his arc of fire covered this area. And then the other vehicles with staggered weapons that had survived were just trying to break through, as again, the rescue force, once they moved in, they fired a Frag T shell and blasted these vehicles in multiple directions, with leaving very little but twisted metal and scraps that were left laying in the street, enabling the MRAP to push through anything that was even left in the street, and for the rest of the convoy to escape. Again, this lasted an hour. As the firefight ensued, the rescue attempt was effectively brought forward immediately, along with strikes from loitering munitions such as the CH-901A with a fragmentation warhead hitting personnel on the roof who were relatively well spread out, as well as also mortar strikes on other buildings. Eventually, little by little, these forces were completely wiped out, with the assault guns finishing off these forces under the bridge. They had the best position of all, being under the bridge, because almost all fire was off limits as they moved into these parking areas under the bridge, including 20 more coming from a manhole cover nearby, getting under this part of the bridge here and laying down fire at the bend. All air and artillery fire, again, was off limits to the immediate vicinity of the highway, but nothing could be especially dropped on the highway, not even mortar strikes, and therefore the assault guns had to use direct fire and certain types of shells, such as Frag T shells, to effectively cause no damage to the infrastructure but wipe these personnel out, which they did. These two began to fire into this group under the parking under the highway and the parking lots and gradually wiped them out. These personnel inside of the building were also hit by direct fire coming from this assault gun / light tank, as it was now firing at multiple targets in the area, and the turret gunner was effectively letting it ride and going crazy on all of the dismounted armed civilian militia personnel that were in the immediate vicinity, as there were only 10 inside the building who were firing out of the glass, or formerly glass, windows of the shopping center facade facing the street in the other building across the shopping center. They're firing out of these former windows, the shopping windows. They were wiped out by the fire from the assault guns / light tanks, and also some fire from the convoy as they were trying to break their way through. Convoy would continue as these assault guns / light tanks were in these positions. They would go behind them up the access road, pull through this parking lot instead of just taking the normal route, and would go all the way cutting through the property of the school grounds to get to the headquarters platoon to drop off the remaining supplies and refuel vehicles with the remaining last fuel truck that had survived, which was now riddled with holes, and some of the fuel was now starting to leak from it and would have to be patched up, as now the rescue attempt would effectively turn into a mopping up effort. The lead vehicle had broken through these concrete walls as they had already blasted them with their main weapon and just drove through them, and now got into the main parking area of the shopping center and dismounted their dismounted heavy infantry squad, while this one would begin to fire into the train station as they were taking fire from the train station as there were personnel inside. And this one, having had moved up some, would dismount its squad into this building where the squad would maintain their position here and then pull in to be able to offer mutual support outside of that building, much like the vehicle was now and the squad were now controlling this area here. This assault gun / light tank would go under the highway and dismount its squad, as these mortars will have by now already annihilated these personnel with precision mortar strikes into this concrete flower bed. While this was going on, as these squads behind these assault gun / light tanks had already cleared the flanks and returned behind their vehicles as the fire was going on, and the artillery had leveled this building and wiped out the personnel in the parking lot along with mortar strikes, 82mm mortars. These 30 personnel that entered this business were completely eradicated by repeated 122mm strikes at the same time the parking garage is being heavily shelled, and also mortar strikes coming in both areas to wipe out these personnel. The assault gun / light tanks were also firing very powerful HE and heat shells at both these buildings, the parking garage and this business, and along with artillery and mortar strikes, it brought all of this completely to the ground and so badly damaged this facade, the whole building on the side was sagging and crumbling into the parking area. As these squads, again, cleared all these buildings on their rear flanks, including this squad going in here and then going in here, and then moving back behind their vehicle, these two squads would move against the hospital, with this squad moving under the bridge first to lay down fire into the hospital anytime anyone came to the window, while these troops on the roof were hit by mortar strikes. This squad with the 240 Bravo, they eventually were wiped out and destroyed by mortar strikes. These personnel were wiped out in this concrete, massive planting box, effectively, with trees and plants. They were wiped out in these positions where they had been taking cover from direct fire. And now the squad moved up and into this position itself to be able to move alongside this squad, which cleared out any survivors of this grouping of 15 that were in here that didn't get destroyed by all the direct fire from the shelling that was fired from the assault gun / light tanks. and effectively would clear the remaining survivors out of this area. Again, at the opening, it has to be remembered, 50 had escaped off the bat at the very opening, and the short distance allowed them to get out with their lives, the short distance from the garage to the manhole cover before they could be targeted and destroyed by any artillery or mortar systems or drones. And then they escaped into, or then this squad, after clearing this, would move into this building, as again, they had escaped these armed civilian militia. Only 50 of them would make it out with their lives. With this squad now clearing this building of the hospital, with the survivors of this grouping of 30 that hadn't been destroyed by the direct fire from Frag T shells and 12.7 millimeter fire, they would clear this grouping of 30 out, while this squad maintained a field of fire to support them from outside according to building clearance procedures, as they would then move into this larger building and clear it, as there were 20 personnel in this particular building who were now being fired at as they came to the windows by this squad out here in the assault gun / light tank, which allowed for the relatively easy breach of this building, although they took some fire from a few personnel as they entered, indicated by the cyan color. They would move through this building and clear these 20 personnel out and completely clear the entire hospital complex, which would take 2 hours effectively to do, as the fighting of the train station would also take time to occur, as well as the two squads, along with their assault guns / light tanks, moved toward the passenger railway station. As the assault guns of each squad, as there were 2 assault guns, as this platoon, part of which was off map, but there were other 2 assault guns effectively facing to the east to defend their headquarters platoon, with the other platoon of the 4 combat platoons off map in the kilometer of space separating the northern map from the southern map. These vehicles gradually moved up as these squads moved up and cleared buildings. As this first squad came out to lay down fire, as this grouping had entered this building, they laid down covering fire to allow this squad to breach. As the squad breached, this squad followed behind, and they cleared this building after an intense battle inside of it against armed civilian militia personnel who tried to put up stout resistance, but were ultimately cut down by the more professional and better equipped, and also better led, as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system provided them with all up-to-date intel on everything, including building layouts, as they literally had every single solitary building plan of all buildings throughout the country, so there were no surprises, and allowed for these forces to be highly effective in building clearance operations, as there were no surprises again, as they knew the layouts and could move through them with ease, due to their constant updates on their combat data links from the squad level and up, as these forces fought their way through this building and wiped out these armed civilian militia personnel. Their next operation would involve storming the railway station, as these vehicles, each of their squads, assault guns / light tanks, gradually moved up to support them from outside of the building, according to building clearance procedures. They would stop just shy of the entrance into the train station by the parking area, and the other one, off map, would continue moving up as well in the same area, while this squad would come out first to provide covering fire, allowing for this squad bound to the corner to allow this squad to breach the building, which they would do, as this building would be unoccupied at the time. This squad would move up to the corner. They would lay down covering fire to allow this squad to breach. This squad, having both olive and cyan, green, over the arrow where it's breaching, indicates that they were taking fire from both militiamen and army reservists as they breached the building. The fighting for the train station would be heavy, and it would last a few hours as well, although the breach of the hospital occurred first before the breach of the train station. The train station would be the last major building on this map to fall, as the fighting in the train station again would be heavy. As this squad, now outside, moved up along the building to support the squad clearing it, they were firing in through windows and doors, and also taking fire from inside the building as they exchanged hand grenades with the Army reservists and small arms fire. There was even Type 69s RPGs from the PLA Marines being fired into the building as well from this squad, as this and 35mm tube-fired grenades from under some of the QBZ-95 rifles of the PLA and Marine combat troops, as this squad gradually moved through the building, fighting the remaining militiamen that were still alive, as there were 20 in the building, with the additional 8-man squad-sized element that had entered of the Army Reservists at the opening of this battle. As these forces had moved to attack from around the corner, they had all been cut down by the heavy machine gun fire during the ambush and were no longer a factor, as the shopping center was now fully cleared, as the rescue effort was a success by these assault gun/light tanks, which also assisted at first in cutting off escape from the forces in the train station, as this assault gun had traded fire with personnel in the train station, mostly using Frag T ammunition, as well as 12.7mm fire. Although the train station was not of critical importance, it was still wanted somewhat intact, as the civilian passenger rail system could be utilized for troop transport and the occupation to follow, as well as colonist transport, and therefore the train station was wanted quasi-intact, as it could be patched up after the battle. As the fighting for the train station was heavy, as the stack teams proceeded through, clearing the train station, the fighting that had occurred in the north happened effectively in general spurts of activity. At first, the activity in the north was simply mammoth, with the Su-34 strikes, followed 30 minutes later by the very powerful J-10 strikes in addition, as well as also massed concentrated artillery fires from the PLZ-07 howitzers of 2 firing batteries devoted to just that area, and also mortar fires from the 82mm Mortar Company of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, sitting in the Carl R. Pipkin Army Reserve site, recently taken by noon. All of this concentrated fire wiped out this massive shopping center, as this grouping of 10 had gone into this concrete planting box in the middle of Phelan Boulevard and Laurel Avenue. They were hit by mass artillery fire at the same time as this airstrike had come in and wiped out these buildings together with artillery fires, and wiped out 20 in this building, 15 in this building, as this was multiple stores. This was 2 stores. And this was a grocery store right here with 40 personnel. All were flattened by this gargantuan airstrike, along with buildings off map to the south, as there was a kilometer separating the north map from the southern map. Buildings in the south of the shopping center were also flattened as well by this massive airstrike of 32,000 combined pounds of air-to-ground munitions from the 4 aircraft. Some of the blast also wiped out parts of this building, along with mortar strikes that were called in, as this building was somewhat near the highway, and thus airstrikes were off limits from this point to this point here, and direct fire was being exchanged before the airstrike had even occurred by these IFVs of this Heavy Amphibious Marine Infantry Company, as they were firing their very powerful 30mm autocannons under the highway at these forces on the other side in these buildings. The dismounted troops from these vehicles were, of course, clearing their flanks in terms of behind them, as they were clearing the buildings behind their lines, as this squad from this vehicle, while the fire was being exchanged in this battle, had cleared this building, this building, this building, and then returned behind their vehicle in a double column rolling shield, as their vehicle served as protection. This squad would remain where they were in the double column rolling shield on this access road right behind their IFV while it was taking fire at the opening from the buildings. And this squad would clear the gas station, then clear this motel, and then clear the rest of the motel, and then return to behind this vehicle while this squad in a double column rolling shield would remain. And the assault gun/light tank company to their north, where the highway bent, where I-10 bent and continued east, were doing much the same in their small area of operations just north of this Heavy Amphibious Marine Infantry Company. This squad cleared this building and returned behind their assault gun. This squad remained in a double column rolling shield. This squad cleared this building, but would remain in the building and have fields of fire to protect their vehicle from behind. While this squad cleared this building and returned behind their vehicle, this squad would remain behind their vehicle in this parking area. This squad outside of their vehicle was in a wedge formation facing to the general north. This squad would clear this building and then return behind their vehicle. This platoon of this assault gun / light tank company here in the north would remain static in a single column on the street, as they could be called up as a sort of reinforcement to any hot spots that might erupt, such as behind the current lines along the highway network, and they could dismount their dismounted troops to assist in any combat operations should they be required. As the ambush had occurred from this building at the very opening of hostilities, with the Army reservists and militiamen on the roof and the others inside of the building firing out at these forces, loitering munition strikes would come in against the forces on the roof, and some would go in and out of the stairwell to avoid being struck, which would take the clearance of this area some more time than would otherwise be required, as they had become relatively hip, so to speak, as the saying went, to the dangers of the PLA and Marine drones, as they had seen firsthand what had happened to their comrades in earlier combat. As the squad went in and got to the roof, they would lay down fire on the flanks of these forces that were firing at the lighter-skinned vehicles, such as the Shangji supply trucks of this headquarters platoon, and even firing at their MRAPs and the IFVs of this platoon that was defending the headquarters platoon in this park. This park had clumps of trees located throughout. This is the parking lot for the park. If one were to look at a map, this park is just to the south of this hospital, as Beaumont had a handful of hospitals. The squad in a rolling T was clearing this larger building, and this squad would remain in a double-column rolling shield, guarding the southern flank of the headquarters platoon here, as the area behind the lines was mostly secured by this point, with very few exceptions, such as this ambush right here, and the ambush that occurred in this area here. For the most part, much of the fighting would involve a mammoth proportion of airstrikes, artillery strikes. Many of these chain restaurants people know of. They're very common chain restaurants. Also hotels, shopping areas, gas stations, and more. Many of these areas would be obliterated by artillery as these forces began on the roof trying to fire down at the assault gun / light tanks, only to take direct 105 millimeter fires from the assault gun and light tanks / light tanks, as well as also massed concentrated artillery fires from the even more potent 122 millimeter shells now being fired by the PLZ-07s at this building, simply smashing it. As these forces had tried to enter the building, they too would be wiped out in this concentrated barrage. Later on in the fighting in the north, other groups, as again the fighting in the north could be described as being more sporadic, other groups would come up out of manhole covers and down the streets into these areas and try to take positions in the rubbles, only to continue to be hit by massed artillery fires, IFV fires from the infantry fighting vehicles, ZBD-05s, and assault gun fires, as well as mortars and more. This was definitely a hellish but climactic battle for the city of Beaumont, as this was the final masterstroke to ensuring that the fourth generation warfare doctrines, at least in this battle space, were fully enabled to be completed according to the strict timetable, as time was everything in this invasion. And nothing could be left to chance, and everything was about precision when it came to the timing. Timing had to be perfect. Everything had to be perfect for this doctrine to fully work. The external invasion component should never have to exit the highway system to engage enemy forces. That was the job of the Trojans, and although the 6th PLA Marine Brigade was not a Trojan force per se, as it did not originate on CCP regime properties like the true Trojan shock forces, they were an external component as they had beach landed from the sea. But they were doing the job of a Trojan force in that they were securing the route for the reinforcements, which were the external invasion forces coming in from both borders. As the beginning would see heavy exchanges of fire from these buildings on the other side of the highway, mostly small arms fire, but some Barrett 50 cal fire at these vehicles, which was all to no avail, as these vehicles were much more heavily armored. Both the assault gun / light tanks and the IFVs, EBD-05s, are much more heavily armored than the vehicles of the supply and logistical forces they had much easier time with in the southernmost map, as the highest rate of success was seen in this particular area, with slight success in the north in terms of the ambush against the headquarters platoon in the park, as they would manage to damage two of these Shangji supply trucks relatively heavily and cause a few KIAs and WIAs in this headquarters platoon. For the most part, as also causing KIAs to the two breaching squads due to the improvised device, as well as WIAs. For the most part, this would be their second greatest success, with their third greatest success being the elimination of an armed combat robot, as well as the wiping out of 3 PLAN Marines with sniper fire. As these forces took some fire, this double column rolling shield behind this armored engineering vehicle here, these were all of the non-armed robots, quad-legged robots that had robotic arms for removing and placing demolition charges, removing mines and other obstacles, and placing obstacles. They were all lined up by the runway and this tarmac here. They had their armored ambulance version of the ZBD-05 here, Shangji supply trucks. They had their own engineering vehicle for the headquarters platoon. This was a bridge-laying vehicle. They had a fuel truck, their command vehicle. Their FPV drone operators and CH-901A drone operators were among all these other headquarters and support troops in this headquarters platoon. The only headquarters vehicles on the perimeter of the airport were these 4 Tiger MRAPs with their heavy machine guns, and of course the combat forces and the armed combat robots, of which there were 5, were spread out among the combat platoons, which numbered 3 of the combat engineer company within the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion. Hundreds of American casualties would result from this battle. Again, only 50 would make it underground to serve as the nucleus of the soon-to-come partisan uprising that would occur later in the city of Beaumont, as they would naturally need plenty of time and planning to get themselves back together. This would be a common trend throughout the duration of the War of Insurgency and Attempted Liberation, as it pertained to the American side, and the War of Colonization, Subjugation, and Occupation on the Chinese side, would see the Americans constantly reconstituting their forces, as they would have a steep learning curve as the coalition's much larger firepower advantage, as well as also their massive technological advantage, would see the Americans having to get creative. Although the technology seemed effectively foolproof and perfect, there were proverbial holes in the armor that could be exploited if one were intelligent enough and capable enough to find them. The Americans, though, again, would have a steep and harsh learning curve where they would lose by the millions members of these partisan forces. As more and more would flock to their ranks, they would constantly have to rebuild their forces after suffering enormous casualties in the early years of the occupation. It would take them years to get battle-hardened and professional enough to where they would begin to exact a heavier toll on the occupation forces. Ambushes like the supply convoy ambush in the southernmost map would be a harbinger of things to come in the future, although the Americans would learn to get out much quicker, regardless of whether they had any real successes or not against these forces. They would learn not to stay anywhere for more than 15 minutes, where they could be hit by a myriad of different resources. As they had stayed in this ambush and this drawn-out firefight for a full hour, they managed to be wiped out by everything from the MRAPs and even the Shangji gunners on the turrets of the Shangji supply trucks to the loitering munition strikes to the mortar strikes. As again, they were at least intelligent enough to place this ambush not only on a corner, which slowed down the convoy to turn, but also near a critical piece of infrastructure that the coalition wouldn't dare drop heavy munitions upon, such as their massive airdropped potential of air-to-ground munitions from their Su-34 strike aircraft, and also their sizable strike capacity of the J-10 fighters when rearmed with air-to-ground munitions, as well as concentrated artillery fire, would not be tolerated near the key highways used for invasion, as well as also for logistics. Therefore, they were at least crafty enough to set up their ambush in what was the perfect spot. However, again, they got drawn into a fight they were not prepared to get out of adequately and safely. They had not made plans to get out in a certain amount of time. They effectively were winging it in terms of timing. Otherwise, they did have an opportunity to evacuate the battle space had they done so much more rapidly. They wrongly assumed that they could keep it going because of their proximity to the highway and effectively have their cake and eat it too, so to speak, as in get whatever supplies were remaining and get back underground. But they took too much time, and as such, they were destroyed in turn, and thoroughly so. As the very opening also saw heavy airstrikes against forces that were further away from the highway system. Many would be destroyed in the suburban housing neighborhood on the other side of the tracks, but behind the rehabilitation hospital, others would be destroyed in these businesses along State Highway 90/College Street in this area here, while the assault gun / light tanks would fire direct and precise fires against the forces that had gathered in the parking area to assist with the ambush. As they were firing on these forces, they're firing down from building tops and out of buildings diagonally at these forces from multiple sides of the ambush. Mortar strikes, drone strikes, and the fire from the vehicles themselves under assault and the assault guns would wipe all of these forces out and ultimately end up clearing all of I-10, because beyond this battle space there's no more resistance whatsoever at all spotted in this area. Even the earlier attacks from armed civilians both outside of and the few inside of the city against the troops holding the vital I-10 crossing in the southwest of Beaumont had ceased because they had been driven off or completely annihilated even by the artillery fire from the single firing battery that had been devoted to this area. Now, all of I-10 would be effectively cleared as this ambushing force had been thoroughly annihilated, as well as those holding key buildings along the highway. Others had been effectively bombed into oblivion by Su-34 strikes. Later in the fighting, at least in the southernmost map, the militia commander himself would make an appearance on the battlefield to monitor what was going on by 4:30 p.m. as the hospital was still in the process of being captured, as was the train station by this point in time. As by 4:30, between 4:30 and 5:30, would be the last hour of this battle on this map, as others would appear at 5. They would be acquired by artillery through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, and strike packages would be sent down to the FDC elements of the firing batteries, who would in turn shell these 8 personnel into oblivion that tried to take positions along the wall, as these personnel of this squad had now by then cleared this building or in the process of doing so. The militia commander himself would effectively move down this road on an all-terrain vehicle, followed by a few others, and this entire grouping would get heavily shelled, as they were not in this area at the very opening, but they had moved into this area by 4:30. They and this follow-up group would be thoroughly annihilated by then, with the battle ending by 5:30, seeing the train station being captured, as just before the train station was captured, the rehabilitation hospital was fully cleared. all of these personnel thoroughly annihilated by the devastating air power, artillery firepower, mortar strikes, which are very thorough and precise, but also destructive enough to where they caused absolute devastation against dismounted forces, and the limited but very effective loitering munition strikes fired by the dedicated drone operators of the headquarters platoon of the southernmost assault gun / light tank company, who were off map in the school grounds. After this area was cleared by 5:30 p.m., in the north, fighting would last a further 15 minutes, as a kilometer away to the north, the vast majority of the militia personnel that had moved into this area to attack both behind the lines and in front had been annihilated by the air, artillery, and direct fire that had been heaved against them by this collection of forces, although there would still be sporadic attacks occurring after the hour-long standoff against the hospital building had effectively been taken care of, the wounded, and of course the KIAs being evacuated out of the hallway as they had breached, with the rest of the squad members of these two squads finishing the building clearance operation, assisted by this squad on the roof firing at those on this roof, with fire being vectored into the building by the IFVs and this Tiger MRAP. With these vehicles having exchanged fire, a small group of 5 would come out, as these personnel had been annihilated by direct fire from both this assault gun and 30mm fire, which practically blasted this gas station to complete and total rubble. And this grouping of 5 coming out of this manhole cover would try to exchange fire, but be wiped out immediately as they came out of this manhole cover across from this clump of trees here. They were seen and destroyed immediately. And this grouping of 10, as they would appear coming out of this manhole cover in this parking lot by 4 p.m., would move through this area and be heavily mortared by repeated 82mm mortar strikes in this parking area around this building. This building had already been shelled and completely crumbled from artillery repeated shell fires from the PLZ-07 howitzers firing concentrated 122mm shell fires. They wiped out the personnel on this roof and those that had entered the building at the very opening. This area was reduced to complete ruination from the airstrikes, as was the shopping center 30 minutes into the battle in the south, and these chain restaurants by concentrated artillery strikes, and this big box store here as well from artillery and air power. This grouping of 5 would join this grouping of 5 by 5:30 p.m. and would be the last group to be destroyed, as they would bound from this building, 5 each, 5 at a time. One would provide covering fire while the other would bound, then the other would follow. As they would get in here, they were seen by the quadcopter assets and marked for absolute destruction. And this would happen by 5:45, with the artillery fire missions coming in and pounding these forces as this first group went and then the next group followed behind. They were pounded shortly after both groups were in this rubble pile of the earlier hit building. But earlier at 5, a grouping of 20 coming out of another drainage system had moved down this street, and they too were hit multiple times by 82mm mortars in front of them and on their flanks, completely wiping all 20 of them out. This being the last group destroyed between 5:30 and 5:45. The battle in the north was effectively over. With their rear flanks secured, the companies would now be able to push out into the rubbled wastelands of the west of Beaumont and push also in a bit into the north to fully secure the areas around I-10. As we go to the map, this area right here was the area in question. This area would be fully secured and they would push their way out. The combat engineers of the Combat Engineer Battalion, as they had 2 unused combat companies, they had at 1:30 p.m. sent one of them to clear the sewage and water treatment plant and eradicate this cluster of armed reactionary civilians who were also just north of I-10, securing this part of I-10. The other unused combat company moving past them by 3 p.m. and clearing out this group north of I-10 as well in the northern northeastern end of the city, while these groups had all fled and were destroyed on the northern city limits. As this battle in the west of the city was unfolding, as half of this group was destroyed outright by both Su-34 airstrikes and also artillery fires, the militia forces, minus 50 again, which become the nucleus of a future resistance partisan element in Beaumont, as they would retreat underground where they would remain for some time to try to regather their strength and even recruit amongst the refugees that were also hiding in the sewer and drainage systems, as there were many thousands of non-combatants hiding underground at this point in time. It always has to be remembered, even as this battle was underway in the heart of the city, there were still non-combatants in the hospital. There were still non-combatants hiding in individual homes, such as in the suburban neighborhood, which extended far off the map, as the airport was 5 miles to the slight southwest of this battle space, the heart of the city here with I-10. There were still non-combatants in the wooded hinterlands just to the northwest and away from the airport, as well as in the houses that were immediately east of the airport in this area, just beyond these businesses on these streets. These side streets contained housing neighborhoods just to the east. There were non-combatants effectively sprinkled throughout the entirety of the Beaumont-Port Arthur battle space, many of them in hiding, as they tried to avoid the crossfire, as the PLA and Marines and Coalition more broadly didn't normally try to eliminate non-combatants on purpose, although they would consider them collateral damage if they were in the way. The non-combatants would be those who would gradually be the recruiting pool for the partisan resistance forces who would rise up against the occupation. As this grouping, in the first hour between 2 and 3 p.m., was wiped out almost near instantaneously by the combination of the airstrikes as the grouping of 30 off map, as there was a full grouping of 200 between those on this map and those just off map. 30 would be wiped out by the combined 12,000 pounds of these two Su-34 strike aircraft, with the massive 32,000 pounds being dropped in this area, wiping all of these personnel out. Again, only 27 made it off map, but most of them would be destroyed as they tried to get to the drainage systems and get under the city by both artillery fires and also airstrikes from J-10s that were hitting that particular area at that time. Again, very few of these forces would make it, as the arrows are not encapsulated. It meant they got into the city and out of just this area here, this 1.5 mile by 1 mile area, alive, but they would be heavily pounded again by artillery and J-10 strikes and mostly destroyed, with very few exceptions, a few getting into the city alive, getting into the drainage and sewage systems, and therefore off the proverbial and literal map, the radar of the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which used the incredible ISR capabilities to have an iron grip over everything that was happening above ground. This tail end would be pounded into complete oblivion by repeated 122mm shell strikes, as would the sniper spotter teams on the hilltops overlooking the airport. Of course, again, the supply vehicles being interdicted happened relatively quickly, even as they sped down the road. They were wiped out by dismounts, by vehicle-based fires, and loitering munition, and the FPV drone strikes. They were hit by numerous different systems at or near simultaneously. Of course, there was direct fire vectored at the forces on the hills as well, but because of the terrain, they were relatively safe from most of the direct fire. The sniper spotter teams, that is. It was a hellish fight, but battle lasting from 2 p.m. to 5:45 p.m. was the make it or break it battle to control I-10 and more broadly the key node that was the city of Beaumont. With the PLA and Marines scoring an undeniable victory in this endeavor by securing I-10, and as a result, ultimately the entire city of Beaumont, as there was no more challengers above ground to attempt to take them on. While they would suffer some casualties, they would ultimately be a drop in the bucket in terms of the entirety of the brigade. Although the loss of logistical vehicles, such as 2 full supply trucks and also a fueler, was a sign to the PLAN Marines of the 6th Brigade of times to come. As lessons would be learned by the armed reactionary civilians turning into partisan outfits or partisan elements, and these lessons would be applied in future operations. What's more is that this was only the first day of the battle in the Beaumont-Port Arthur battle space, but the first day itself was the make it or break it day, so to speak. It would be the day that would determine overall how the invasion would end, and it would be a resounding, decisive success. Militarily, the United States would be crushed, as its military and defense apparatus was not at all prepared for such a brutal and savage and rapid campaign of mass destruction. However, the armed civilian population, while large, was mostly incompetent in terms of war fighting, but over time would learn the skills necessary to become a fighting force. While not a formidable fighting force at first, like most partisan or insurgent elements early on in these types of wars, over time they would acquire the skills required to become quasi-effective, and then more effective, and then ever more effective as time would go on. And these forces would evolve and age like fine wine. Again, the wine press would squeeze the blood out of the American population in the very literal sense, as this war would be a wine press on the American people. But they would continue to resist. As the government fell and the nation would no longer be a nation, it would be no longer a political entity on a map. It would no longer have a government except for the CCP regime and its colonial government. The American population would be forced into servitude, while others would go underground, both literally and figuratively, and resist. Most of the population, by the 4th day of the invasion, before the official occupation phase would set in, will have fled from urban areas, although there would still be sizable swathes of the U.S. population that would be under urban areas, hiding underground. With large proportions fleeing to the tertiary areas of the country that were further away from human settlements and developed areas, these forces in the rural hinterlands would also begin to form the nucleus of large partisan forces that would fight from the countryside, while some others would begin their fights in urban areas from underground. The occupation forces would have to tailor their tactics accordingly, as they would be fighting in diverse environments, as this was a vast nation with a vast number of cities of different sizes and towns of different sizes, and rural areas of different terrain features. Again, they would have to tailor their plans accordingly. At least within the Beaumont/Port Arthur battle space, the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade had obtained a massive victory on day 1. And the string of victories would continue, but there would be some costs. As by day 2, as they would send their air assault battalion to effectively conduct search and destroy operations and clear out the northern hinterlands of partisan or armed resistance forces of the militia variety. The first grouping they would assault on a pre-dawn raid would be a militia group that had paired up with the 50 U.S. Marine survivors from the first day of the invasion, as early on the very first day, 50 surviving Marines of the Alpha Company and Weapons Company combined of the 1st of the 123rd Marine Battalion had fled into the swampy, marshy, and wooded hinterlands of the northwest of the city of Beaumont and linked up with local civilian militia forces numbering 500. They, combined, were trying to put together their own resistance forces to continue fighting the invaders. This would be the first group to be struck on a pre-dawn raid carried out by two PLAN Marine Air Assault Infantry companies who would be backed up by their 82mm mortar company in their same position north of the city on the 96 Highway Bridge area, and also their combat aviation company of Z-9WA attack helo gunships, which were very potent weapons of war and would be utilized to assist the ground forces scouring the woods and swamps for these resistors and laying down punishing firepower upon them. Between 6 p.m. on the first day, on October the 4th, and 9 p.m. would be the hours by which the external invasion prong of group armies would be entering the battle space in its many miles long convoy of PLA group armies and moving up I-10 through these freshly captured key nodes along the I-10 belt that ran through this battle space. As the 6th PLA and Marine Brigade had secured Beaumont, Vidor, and Orange after first securing Port Arthur, which Port Arthur didn't sit on I-10, but it was their springboard to capturing these other places, would see the 6th PLA and Marine Brigade holding these nodes to allow for the entire convoy of group armies to get through their battle space and into the next battle space, and ultimately, as the next battle space sat within the larger southeast invasion sector, into that sector as the heavy-handed reinforcements, according to fourth-generation warfare doctrines of the Trojan shock armies doing the heavy lifting in those areas of the overall campaign. In the next video of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines through the lens of a Sino-Russian coalition invasion, the battle to clear out the remaining resistance forces in this primary invasion space of Beaumont Port Arthur, as in primary, as in the initial area in which the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade was operating before they would branch out into secondary areas. The Air Assault Battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade would conduct its pre-dawn raid on day 2 to flush out and destroy the armed reactionary civilian militia forces in the northwest of the Beaumont Port Arthur battle space in the hinterlands, along with the 50 U.S. Marines that were paired with them. This would end up being a slightly more difficult battle than originally was anticipated, because the 50 remaining U.S. Marines still had certain weapons at their disposal, and along with their militia comrades in arms they had recently met early on day 1 and had an entire day to plan with, had come up with defensive plans that would see small levels of success against the attacking forces of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade. As the timing between 6 p.m., when the externals are passing through the battle space, and midnight would see a brief maintenance, rest, and resupply period for all of the 6th PLA Marine Brigade forces. There would also be planning going on at this time as well through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system being utilized by the command elements of the 6th PLA Marine Brigade to plan the next steps of the operation, which would be this assault against the hinterlands and the remaining militia forces and resistance elements that sat thereupon, using the Air Assault Battalion and some of its comprising companies backed up to the hilt by all manner of firepower, which also included the coalition air power above the skies of the Beaumont Port Arthur battle space, and possibly even artillery firepower with extended range ammunition from their current firing positions in the south of the city of Beaumont. More to come in the next video.